The faintest shimmer caught my eye that morning. Sunlight peeked through the bathroom blinds, catching on a tiny foil disc on the carpet, almost hidden in the shadows near Jane's side of the sink. It was a small, circular backing from a pill strip, something I wouldn't have paid attention to, except for the fact that it was a birth control pill. We hadn't used birth control in years. After the birth of our second child, I'd had a vasectomy, something we both agreed on, considering how exhausting it was balancing work, kids, and everything in between. I felt a chill creep through me. Why would Jane have birth control pills? My heart started racing, and I had to take a deep breath, forcing myself to think of anything but the most obvious conclusion. Maybe it was an old pack she'd never thrown away. I wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. Our marriage had been solid, or at least I thought so. We had 2 beautiful kids, a stable home, and Jane was the kind of wife I'd always trusted completely. But trust or not, I needed answers. I went back to the bathroom and searched through her drawers, trying to convince myself I wasn't overreacting. Then, in the back of her bottom drawer, hidden beneath a box of cotton swabs, was a nearly full pack of birth control pills. My heart sank as I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of something I couldn't yet name. My mind raced with possibilities, but each one felt worse than the last. Maybe she was taking them for hormonal issues, I told myself, though I couldn't recall any recent doctor's visits. Maybe she planned to tell me but forgot. I let out a long, shaky breath, setting the pills back exactly as I'd found them, the foil disc carefully tucked in my pocket. I had no intention of confronting her. Not yet. All day at work, the thought gnawed at me. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind reeling with every worst-case scenario imaginable. Jane was out with friends that night, so I had a few hours to myself. I poured myself a drink, the bitter taste of scotch barely noticeable as I tried to piece together the situation in my head. What I needed was a plan. If I brought it up with Jane, I needed proof. If I was wrong, if this was all some horrid misunderstanding, I'd destroy something beautiful between us for nothing. But if I was right, if Jane was hiding something, I didn't even know where to start. The following week, I installed a small voice recorder in her car, along with a couple of discreet cameras around the house. I hated myself for it. I'd always prided myself on honesty and transparency, and here I was, sneaking around like some paranoid stranger. But a part of me couldn't ignore the thought, the need to know if there was something happening right under my nose. Each day felt like an eternity. I'd go to work, come home, and check the recordings when Jane was asleep. For days, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Jane's routine was the same. Our evenings were as familiar as ever, but that only made the suspicion burrow deeper. How could she act so normal if there was someone else? Then, one night, I noticed a small change. We were getting ready for bed when she turned her back to me, glancing at her phone, her lips curving into a subtle smile before quickly tucking it under her pillow. She slipped under the covers without a word, her gaze distant as I tried to engage her in small talk. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel the doubt. That smile. It wasn't the kind of look you gave when reading a work email or chatting with a friend. I felt my chest tighten as I lay there beside her, barely able to breathe. I wanted to ask her what she was smiling at, but something held me back, some primal need to avoid confrontation until I had the full picture. The weeks dragged on, and my investigation expanded. I bought a secondary phone and cloned hers, allowing me to intercept her messages and see her call history. It felt surreal, like I was an outsider looking in on someone else's life. But it wasn't someone else. It was my wife. Finally, on a Wednesday evening, the first piece of the puzzle fell into place. She'd texted someone named Eric. The conversation was short, almost cryptic, but unmistakably flirtatious. She'd mentioned a meeting and something about looking forward to seeing him. My heart stopped as I read the words, each one confirming the worst suspicions that had been brewing in my mind for weeks. I sat in our dimly lit living room, staring at her messages, trying to control the anger boiling inside me. I read through each line over and over, dissecting every word, every phrase. She'd laughed at his jokes, made inside references I didn't understand, and even mentioned how much she appreciated him being there for her. As the clock struck midnight, I heard Jane coming down the hall, her footsteps soft and measured. She walked into the living room, looking a little surprised to see me still awake. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. For a moment, her familiar warmth and sincerity almost made me doubt everything I'd seen. "Just a lot on my mind," I said, managing a smile that I hoped looked genuine. She nodded, coming to sit beside me on the couch. "Anything you want to talk about?" I hesitated, staring down at my hands. I could feel her eyes on me, searching, maybe even worried. But what was she worried about? Me, or the secret she'd been keeping? "No, it's just work stuff," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "But thanks. I'll be fine." She placed her hand on mine, her touch as soft and comforting as it had always been. And that, somehow, made it worse. Her kindness, her concern, all of it felt like a cruel joke now. In the following days, I decided I needed something more concrete, something irrefutable. If I was going to confront her, I couldn't rely on a handful of ambiguous texts and gut feelings. I needed to see it with my own eyes. On Friday night, I told Jane I'd be working late, giving me the chance to install another camera in our bedroom. I placed it discreetly on a shelf that faced the bed, hidden behind a stack of old books. Then I waited. That weekend, she told me she'd be heading out for a work brunch with some of her colleagues. Normally, I'd take her word for it without a second thought, but this time I watched her closely as she left the house, her demeanor calm and casual as always. I waited an hour before checking the recordings, heart pounding as I opened the app on my phone. There she was, in our bedroom, a few hours after she'd said goodbye to me. She was on her phone, texting someone, her face lit with a smile that was both familiar and entirely foreign. Then she did something that confirmed every last suspicion I'd been harboring. She reached into the back of our closet, pulling out a small, sleek phone I'd never seen before. A second phone. She unlocked it, typing out a quick message before tucking it into her purse and heading out. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer. She wasn't just lying to me. She was actively concealing parts of her life. I'd given her my trust, my loyalty, and here she was, hiding secrets with someone else. My thoughts swirled, a mix of anger, sadness, and a desperate, overwhelming need to understand why. By the following Monday, I had a full plan in place. I called in a favor from an old friend who worked in cybersecurity, and within a few days, he managed to pull more information from her secondary phone. The name Eric came up repeatedly, along with references to money and vague talk of preparations and finalizing things. I started to realize that this wasn't just an affair. It was something bigger, something meticulously planned. One particular message from her to Eric froze me in place. She'd written, "Once everything's set, he won't suspect a thing. He's always been so trusting. Almost too easy, don't you think?" The message stung, each word like a poison seeping into my veins. I'd loved her with every part of me, and she saw it as nothing more than a weakness to exploit. I scrolled further, uncovering a chain of emails that turned my stomach. She'd been transferring money from our joint account to another, smaller account, one she'd opened without my knowledge. I could see the transactions, each one carefully hidden, spread out over the past few years. They were small amounts, nothing that would raise suspicion, but together they added up to a sizable sum, enough for her to walk away comfortably. A sharp pain hit me, not just from the betrayal but from the realization that the woman I'd shared my life with had been planning to leave me long before I'd ever noticed anything wrong. And not just leave. She was planning to take as much as she could with her. In that moment, everything clicked. The shopping sprees, the excuses, the sudden need for space and independence. All of it had been part of a long game. And I had been the fool who financed it all, completely unaware that the woman I loved was counting on me to fall for her lies. When Jane came home that night, she looked tired, but content. I watched her move around the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared dinner, her movements graceful and unhurried. I felt a surge of anger rise within me, but I forced myself to stay calm, watching her every move as if I could somehow find the answer to all my questions in her gestures and expressions. As she set the table, she looked up at me, a faint smile on her lips. "Long day?" she asked, a hint of warmth in her voice. "Yeah," I replied, my voice flat. I couldn't bring myself to say anything more. She didn't seem to notice, busying herself with dinner preparations, humming a tune under her breath. I watched her carefully, taking in every detail, every movement, as if this were the last time I'd see her like this. Because in many ways it was. The woman I had once loved, the woman I had trusted with my heart, was gone. All that was left was a stranger wearing her face, hiding secrets I was only just beginning to uncover. And as I watched her, a plan began to take shape in my mind. A plan to make sure she understood exactly what she had done. I spent the rest of the evening pretending to be the oblivious, doting husband. I smiled when she talked about her day, nodded at all the right moments, even managed to laugh when she told me a story about a funny client at work. But underneath, I was mapping out every step of what needed to come next. My calm exterior was a mask, concealing the maelstrom of anger and betrayal that had taken root in my chest. As we cleared the dishes, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront her yet. No, Jane didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me broken, not when she was basking in the thrill of her secret life. If she thought she could play me, I'd play her right back. The next day, I called in sick to work. Jane, oblivious as ever, kissed me goodbye and told me to take it easy. I almost laughed at the irony. As soon as she was gone, I got to work. First, I called the bank to get statements and freeze her secret account. With the information from her secondary phone, I tracked down every single transfer she'd made. The amounts, though small, added up over time. Like a slow drip from a leaky faucet, money she'd been funneling into an account I was sure she'd planned to disappear with. Once I had that account locked, I called a private investigator. I needed evidence beyond the bank's statements and texts. I wanted irrefutable proof of every lie she'd ever told me. The PI, a quiet guy named Alan with a tired look in his eyes, assured me he'd keep me updated as he tracked Jane's movements. In the meantime, I couldn't resist digging a little deeper myself. I went back to her secondary phone and found a chain of emails with Eric. One particular email thread stopped me cold. She was talking about the plan and how they'd timed everything perfectly. Eric's response was what hit hardest. As long as we can keep milking him for the cash, there's no rush. He doesn't suspect a thing. I gripped the phone, a chill creeping through me. This wasn't just infidelity. They were using me. Using me. It took everything in me not to throw her phone across the room. I'd been so stupid, so trusting. I'd spent years working late, taking on extra projects to build a future for our family, only to find out that my partner had been siphoning off my efforts like some kind of parasite. And worse, she'd done it all with a smile. The next few days were torture, waiting for Alan to get back to me. But then, on Friday afternoon, he called. His voice was steady, almost cautious. "David," he said, "I think you'll want to see this in person." An hour later, I was sitting in his cramped office, surrounded by stacks of papers and a dozen coffee cups. He slid an envelope across the table, his face carefully neutral. "You're not going to like it," he warned, but I didn't need the warning. I was prepared for anything at this point, or so I thought. Inside were photos, printed out in glossy, high-resolution detail. Jane and Eric, meeting up at a secluded park, their heads close as they whispered and laughed. There was another picture of them at a fancy hotel downtown, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his fingers brushing her cheek. The last one, the one that made my stomach lurch, was of the two of them walking into a bank together. That was where the money had been going, straight into her account, shared with him. "Where did you get these?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Alan shrugged. "Hotel security cameras, a friend at the bank. It's all within legal bounds, but just barely." He hesitated, his eyes darkening. "David, they're planning something big. Whatever it is, it's going down soon. You might want to act fast." I left Alan's office feeling like I'd been hit by a freight train. The betrayal was deeper than I'd ever imagined. Jane wasn't just cheating. She'd been planning an escape, a life with Eric built on my hard work and my savings. And from the look of things, they'd intended to bleed me dry before vanishing. That night, I made my next move. Jane had another meeting the following afternoon, so I took the opportunity to do a little redecorating. I took down the family photos from the living room, the wedding picture from our bedroom, and any trace of shared memories. It was petty, maybe even childish, but I didn't care. If she wanted a fresh start, I'd give her one. When she returned, I watched her face as she noticed the empty walls. Her brow furrowed, but she didn't say anything. I wondered if she suspected anything, if she could see the subtle changes in me. My smile a little too tight, my tone a bit too calm. But if she did, she didn't let on. She'd gotten too comfortable in her double life to notice the storm brewing around her. By Sunday, I was ready to put the final pieces into place. I called Alan again, asking him to dig deeper into Eric's life. I wanted everything: his finances, his job, his address. Alan came through within hours, texting me a file full of information. Turns out, Eric had debts, big ones: gambling, loans, a small mountain of bills he'd been avoiding for years. As I scrolled through the report, an idea began to take shape. Jane and Eric had used me, manipulated me, lied to my face. And if they thought they could just walk away without consequences, they had another thing coming. The following week, I set the trap. I met with a lawyer, securing a prenuptial agreement I drafted as soon as we were married, but never felt the need to enforce. The document, combined with evidence of her financial deception, ensured that Jane would walk away with as little as legally possible. Then, I transferred all my business assets into a trust, safeguarding them from her grasp. That Friday, I called Jane and told her I'd arranged a romantic dinner for us. I pretended to be the loving, clueless husband she thought I was, and she played along, acting as if nothing was wrong. But as she got dressed that night, I saw her slipping glances at her phone, smiling at texts from Eric. Dinner was tense but cordial. I watched her closely, my heart pounding as I waited for the right moment. And finally, as we finished dessert, I slid the bank statement across the table. "What's this?" she asked, her face blanching as she looked down. "You tell me," I replied, my voice calm. "It's your account, the one you've been siphoning money into. Care to explain?" Her face paled, but she quickly masked her shock, putting on a look of defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about, David. You're being paranoid." "Am I?" I took out my phone, scrolling to the photo of her and Eric entering the bank. I slid it across the table, watching as her composure cracked, her eyes widening with panic. This is," she stammered, reaching for an excuse, any excuse. But there was nothing she could say. I'd caught her, red-handed. "Who is he?" I demanded, though I already knew. "And how long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her face contorted with anger and shame. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me, Jane, what exactly is it?" She glared at me, her mask slipping entirely, revealing the cold, calculating side I'd never seen before. "Fine," she spat. "You want the truth? I'm tired of this life, David. Tired of you. This marriage. I deserve better, and Eric can give me that." "Better?" I laughed bitterly, the sound echoing through the empty restaurant. "You mean my money. You've been planning to leave, haven't you? Slowly bleeding me dry until you had enough to disappear." She didn't deny it, her lips pressed together in a defiant line. "You wouldn't understand. You've always been so predictable. I needed someone who made me feel alive." The words stung, each one cutting deeper than the last. But I forced myself to remain calm. "I trusted you, Jane. I would have done anything for you." "Then maybe you shouldn't have been so trusting." Her voice was cold, her eyes challenging. "You never understood what I needed. You've always been so simple." I felt my resolve harden, the anger boiling over, but kept in check. "Is that so? Well, let's see how simple things are for you now." I pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. "These are divorce papers. Everything is in here, including evidence of your financial theft and infidelity. If you sign, I'll make this easy. You'll get a small settlement, and I won't press charges. But if you fight me, I'll make sure you lose everything." Her face turned pale as she realized the extent of my preparation. She reached for the folder, hands shaking, and flipped through the pages in stunned silence. For the first time, she looked afraid. "This isn't fair," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I deserve more." I stood up, my heart pounding as I looked down at her. "You deserve exactly what you gave me, Jane." "Nothing." Jane sat in the dimly lit restaurant, her once defiant expression now a mask of confusion and fear. Her hands trembled as she rifled through the divorce papers, the full scope of my preparation hitting her like a hammer. The satisfaction of watching her fall apart gave me a strange, dark sense of clarity. But I wasn't finished. This wasn't just about divorce or even exposing her lies. It was about dismantling the life she tried to build behind my back. When Jane finally looked up, her face had settled into something resembling composure. "You really think you can do this, David?" she asked, her voice tight with defiance. But I could see the fear beneath it, the realization that I wasn't going to roll over like she'd planned. "I already have, Jane," I replied calmly. "And believe me, I'm only getting started." That night, I returned home alone. Jane went to stay with a friend, some woman I'd met once or twice who I guessed had been part of her scheme. She didn't bother asking for my forgiveness or trying to make amends. Her eyes told me she was already calculating her next move. But I'd anticipated this. As I sat in my study, a scotch in one hand, I scrolled through the new information I'd received from Alan. He'd found details I hadn't even imagined, payments Jane had made to a private storage unit, a P.O. box she'd opened 2 years ago, even a safety deposit box in her name at a bank I didn't recognize. It was all part of a web of deception she'd spun around our life together, carefully hidden to ensure I'd never see it coming. I knew that to take her down, I'd need more than a simple divorce and some bank statements. Jane was like a cornered animal now, and she'd use every trick she had to protect her secrets. So I started gathering my own arsenal. I installed a new set of surveillance devices around the house, this time in places I knew she wouldn't think to check. I planted a voice recorder in the vents near her side of the bed, another behind the clock in the kitchen, and a tiny camera hidden in a bookend in the study. I even upgraded the software on her clone phone, allowing me to track her location in real time and see her messages and call logs as they came in. It was strange, spying on someone I'd once loved so completely. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized how little I'd known about her, how blind I'd been to the deceit lurking behind those familiar eyes. This was no longer about love or betrayal. It was about control, about making sure she could never take another cent or another piece of my life. 2 days later, Jane returned home, her face a mask of indifference. She avoided eye contact, walking past me as if I were a stranger, and headed straight to the bedroom without a word. I watched her go, my jaw clenched as I waited for her to make the first move. That evening, she made herself scarce, disappearing into her room with her laptop. I knew she was planning something. Jane was far too cunning to give up without a fight. And sure enough, just after midnight, I caught a ping on her clone phone. It was a message to Eric. "Things are complicated. Need more time to get everything out without him noticing." I clenched my fists, a surge of anger flaring up, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was exactly what I needed. Proof that she was actively hiding assets, that she was planning to walk away with far more than she deserved. With each new message, she was practically building my case for me. Over the next week, I watched and listened as Jane scrambled to salvage her plans. I tracked her as she drove across town to that storage unit, her car parked out front for nearly an hour while she loaded boxes into the trunk. Alan had already helped me access the facility's records, revealing that she'd been renting the unit for almost 2 years under her maiden name. What she didn't know was that I'd already hired a locksmith to bypass her lock. Later that evening, I drove over to the storage unit, the place eerily deserted in the late-night darkness. Alan had provided me with a code for the front gate, and within minutes, I was inside. As I reached her unit, the heavy metal door looming in front of me, I felt a strange mix of dread and exhilaration. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew it would be significant. When I lifted the door, I was greeted by the sight of dozens of carefully labeled boxes. Some were filled with clothes, others with documents and what looked like keepsakes from our life together. But as I rifled through the papers, my heart pounded. Here were copies of our financial records, bank statements, even property deeds, all things she'd meticulously cataloged for her own ends. At the very bottom of one box, wrapped in an old blanket, was something that stopped me cold. A notebook. The notebook was filled with careful, neat handwriting, each page dated and organized. I flipped through the entries, my stomach churning as I read her thoughts, her plans. Each entry detailed the ways she could siphon off money without me noticing, ideas for hiding funds, strategies for convincing me to sell certain assets. She'd even made notes on my weaknesses, moments she'd observed when I'd let down my guard or been too trusting. One entry in particular made my blood run cold. David's too trusting, too focused on work. He'll never see this coming. If I play my cards right, I can walk away with everything. House, savings, and a fresh start. Eric and I just have to be patient. I put the notebook down, feeling a fury I'd never known rise within me. This was no ordinary affair. Jane had been plotting to rob me of everything, to drain our life of every meaningful part until she could leave me a hollow shell. I knew then that my revenge would have to be more than just a divorce. I would have to dismantle her plans piece by piece, watching as her carefully laid web crumbled into dust. When I got back home, I locked the notebook in my safe, alongside a small flash drive where I'd stored every recording and screenshot I'd gathered. I knew that with these pieces of evidence, I had enough to not only ensure a swift divorce in my favor, but also to bring criminal charges if I wanted. But I wasn't satisfied with just legal action. Jane needed to feel the same helplessness, the same betrayal that she'd inflicted on me. I wanted her to watch everything she'd built with Eric fall apart, her dreams of a fresh start slipping through her fingers. My first move was to set a trap. I discovered through Alan that Jane and Eric had been funneling money into a third account under Eric's name. It was an offshore account, hidden in a bank I knew well from my work connections. I called in a favor, using some connections to plant a flag on the account that would trigger an investigation by the bank's compliance team. Within a few days, their funds would be frozen, and they'd be notified of the investigation, tipping them off just enough to let them know that their plan was in danger. Next, I tracked down Eric's employer, a mid-level consulting firm downtown, and arranged an anonymous tip. I let them know that Eric was involved in suspicious financial activities and suggested they might want to audit his accounts. I had no idea if they'd take it seriously, but with his financial history, it wouldn't take long before they found something damning. The final piece of my plan required a bit more finesse. Through Alan, I discovered that Eric was in debt to several unsavory characters, loan sharks and bookies he'd been ducking for years. I knew that if I played my cards right, I could make sure his debts became very, very public. I made a few calls, arranging for some of his creditors to be informed of his recent activities and newfound financial resources. Within days, word spread, and Eric found himself under a very different kind of scrutiny. The following Monday, I received a call from Jane's lawyer. She was filing a claim on several of our shared assets, hoping to claim half the house and a portion of my business. I almost laughed at the audacity, but I kept my tone calm, agreeing to meet her lawyer to discuss the terms. What Jane didn't know was that my lawyer had already built a rock-solid case against her. In addition to the evidence of her infidelity, we had documentation of her financial misconduct, the hidden accounts, and her carefully written plans to defraud me. 2 days later, I met with her and her lawyer, maintaining a polite, almost detached demeanor. As they laid out their demands, I let them talk, pretending to consider her claims. And then, at just the right moment, I opened my briefcase and slid a stack of documents across the table. "Perhaps," I said, meeting Jane's gaze, "we should talk about your assets." Her face paled as she glanced at the documents. There, in black and white, was everything. Her hidden accounts, the offshore funds, even the details of her storage unit and the notebook I'd found. The color drained from her face as she realized that her secrets were no longer hidden. "David," she stammered, her voice cracking, but I held up a hand to stop her. "No more lies, Jane. It's over." I could see the shock in her eyes, the dawning horror as she understood the depth of her failure. But as I stood up to leave, I knew she wasn't just feeling fear. She was beginning to realize that I'd beaten her at her own game. As I left the conference room, leaving Jane and her lawyer in stunned silence, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction brewing within me. It wasn't over yet. I'd taken away the element of surprise, shattered her plans, but I wanted her to experience the same shock and betrayal she'd inflicted on me, layer by painful layer. This wasn't just about retribution. It was about ensuring she knew that every step she took was one I'd anticipated, and I'd been waiting for her to fall right into it. That evening, I called Alan. "It's time," I said simply. Understood, he replied. Over the past few days, he had been tracking Jane and Eric's digital footprints, scouring for every misstep they had made. It turned out that Eric's reckless financial decisions hadn't just drained my accounts. They had led him to take out dangerous loans, betting on Jane's plan working out. The debts were larger than I had even realized, and now, with their offshore account flagged and their assets frozen, they were backed into a corner. Alan had arranged for one last surveillance. We tracked down a series of emails between Jane and Eric discussing a final emergency stash, hidden in another safety deposit box across town. My aim wasn't just to drain it. It was to watch them try and fail to access it, to feel the door slam shut on every escape route they'd planned. 2 days later, I received word from Alan that they were planning a last-ditch meeting at the bank. I cleared my schedule and watched the live feed from the hidden camera Alan had planted outside the bank entrance. Jane's face was tight with tension as she entered, her eyes darting nervously. She looked thinner, her usual cool facade cracking under the pressure. Eric followed, glancing around as if expecting to see trouble around every corner. They stepped up to the counter and presented their IDs to access the box. But, just as Alan and I had arranged, the bank manager returned with a tight-lipped expression, shaking his head. "What do you mean it's frozen?" Jane's voice rose, the first hint of desperation cracking through. The manager kept his voice calm. "I'm afraid there's been a security hold placed on this account, ma'am. You'll have to come back at a later time, once this issue is resolved." Jane's face twisted, and she looked at Eric with a growing panic. I watched as she glanced around, as though the walls were closing in. There it was, the betrayal, the helplessness, painted clearly on her face. I let out a long breath, feeling the weight of satisfaction settle over me. It wasn't the end, but it was a taste of what was coming. When I finally confronted her, it was back at our house. I'd arranged for the kids to stay with their grandparents for the weekend, leaving us alone in the home we built together. Jane showed up at the door, her face drawn and wary. I could tell she was desperate, uncertain, trying to figure out what cards she had left to play. As she walked in, she took in the nearly empty walls, the boxes stacked near the front door, everything prepared for her departure. "You've been busy," she said, her voice tight. "You have no idea," I replied, my tone calm. I watched her gaze flicker, realizing the extent of my preparation. There was no pleading, no apology in her eyes, only anger and a flicker of desperation. "Do you really think you can take everything from me?" she hissed, a bitter edge to her words. "After everything I've put up with, after all I've done for you?" I almost laughed. "What you've done for me? Jane, you plan to gut me financially, disappear with everything I'd worked for. The only thing you've done for me is give me a very clear perspective on what kind of person you are." Her mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "You're such a fool, David. Always trying to play the hero. That's why I did it. You're weak, predictable." I wouldn't be so sure about that. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a restraining order, something Alan had helped me fast-track given the evidence of her financial misconduct and fraud. She took it from me, her eyes widening as she read. "You're actually doing this?" "Yes, Jane, I am. You've been evicted from this house, effective immediately, and I'll be moving for full custody of the kids." She laughed bitterly. "You really think you can keep them from me?" I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice cold. "You stole from their future. You betrayed their father. Believe me, the courts will see this exactly as it is." She stared at me, that final flicker of fight in her eyes, but it was nothing more than desperation. She lost, and we both knew it. 2 weeks later, the final piece of my plan went into motion. Alan had been keeping tabs on Eric, and we discovered that he'd been trying to negotiate with his creditors. But, with their funds frozen and his debtors closing in, his options were running out fast. One evening, Alan called me with an update that was too satisfying to ignore. "Eric's been picked up," he told me, barely containing his satisfaction. Apparently, his creditors had finally found him. Jane's accomplice was now facing charges for his debts and shady dealings. When Jane heard the news, she showed up at my office, her face pale, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The sight almost made me pity her. Almost. "What did you do, David?" she demanded, voice trembling with fury. "You're ruining us." "No, Jane," I replied, standing firm. "You did that yourself. You gambled with our family's future. You lied. You manipulated. And now you're facing the consequences. This is what happens when you betray the people who trust you." Her shoulders slumped, the anger draining from her. She looked hollow, her eyes sunken, her usual confidence shattered. I'd finally broken through the shell she'd worn for so long, revealing the brittle, vulnerable person beneath. For the first time, she looked like she was truly feeling the weight of her decisions. "This wasn't how it was supposed to end," she whispered, her voice a shadow of the confident woman she'd been. "No, it wasn't," I replied, almost sadly. "But that's what happens when you try to burn everything down to build something new. You end up with nothing." As the divorce finalized, the judge ruled decisively in my favor. Jane left the courtroom defeated, stripped of any significant assets. She'd lost her stake in the house, and she'd been granted only supervised visitation with the kids until the custody arrangements were solidified. Months passed, and the pieces of my life slowly fell back into place. Jane moved out of town, taking her bitterness and regret with her. Eric was facing legal trouble that would keep him tied up for years. And as for me, I'd found a peace I never expected to feel again. The rage, the betrayal, it all faded in time, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. I poured myself back into my work, my kids, my friends, slowly rebuilding the life I'd nearly lost. And as I looked around our house, finally free of Jane's cold presence, I felt a strange, unexpected sense of relief. In the end, she tried to take everything from me, but she'd only freed me, giving me a chance to build something real, something worth fighting for. The betrayal had left scars, yes, but it had also left me with clarity, strength, and a future that was mine alone. And as I watched my kids grow, filling the house with laughter and light, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The life I'd built, the life I now treasured, it was finally mine, and no one could take it from me again. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.